Welcome to Ron Talk Double E, the last YouTube in this five-part series called Christianity, a Reboot. My name is Ron Rude. We've been talking a lot about God's ancient and vast story of life. There are several ways to look at this, obviously some with more credibility than others. Creationism, the least credible, says that God created the universe, including Earth, about 6,000 years ago, and every species was created as is. No evolution. God made chipmunks, cacti, dolphins, and humans. There is no such thing as a predecessor species. Also in this view, not only were dinosaurs around when humans roamed the earth, but God planted fossils in various geological layers when He created the world 6,000 years ago just to throw us off. These folks tend to reject just about everything the natural sciences have taught us, though they thoroughly embrace scientism, that is, humans using scientific engineering to dominate nature. Then there's something called intelligent design. In this view, the universe could have been created in 6 days, 6,000 years ago, or it could have been created over billions and billions of years through evolution. Either way is fine. However, some kind of intelligence is behind it all and directing it all. It could be a religiously oriented creator divinity or God, or it could be a more scientific creative intelligence. But either way, there is order, intelligence, and design to everything. Someone is in charge. The God of the gaps view is concerned with the major gaps in our understanding within the natural sciences, things that we haven't been able to figure out yet. Like, how did nothing become something? Maybe this is where God comes in, though Stephen Hawking suggests that there's always been something. Another gap is, how did non-life become life? This seems to be a pretty big jump also. Could the factor here be God? I mentioned in the first Good Talk AA the huge leap from single cell life to multiple cell life, which took about 3 billion years to accomplish. Was God the one who made this happen? And finally, the question of consciousness. Certain species, including humans, seem to have consciousness. Well, what is that? No one knows. A God figure in this view is invoked to fill the gaps. And then finally, there's the notion of an evolving and ever-changing universe and life forms evolving to fit in with this ever-changing change. This view says that there may be a God or there may not, but evolution doesn't really need a God figure for evolution to work. The watch doesn't need a supreme intelligent watchmaker to make it. No, in evolution, life bubbles up from below. Simple life forms evolve into other life forms and even more complex life forms through natural selection. Personally, I accept the evidence for and find endlessly intriguing the various natural sciences that embrace the theory of evolution. Though I have to say that I believe God is in, under, with, behind, and over it all. But this is totally a faith statement. I can't prove it. And I'm not even sure what I mean by it, but this is what makes sense to me at this time in my life anyway. So, how about you? Well, what are the main tenets of this reboot that I've been talking about? This alternative version of Christianity, which I think is a better version for our time of God's story of life and God's story of Jesus. My 2 books, Able Emerging and Reconsidering Christianity, delve into this in much more biblical and theological and scientific detail, and I'll give some information about these on the last slide. But here are the main points of this reboot. Number 1, God's creation is ancient, vast, and evolving, rather than young, earth-focused, human-focused, or fixed. 2, we share the dwelling places in God's household with about 20 million other species on Earth. As humans, we get one of these dwelling places. Number 3, death is a part of God's Tov story of life, rather than a curse or a punishment for human sin. In fact, Jesus didn't come to overcome death. Rather, he came to overcome perishing. And to be perishing is to be out of relationship with neighbor, with creation, with our own inner spirits and souls and selves, and with God. So a person could be walking around town alive today and still be perishing. Or someone else could have died this morning and not be perishing at all. Number 4, ecosystems and life forms on Earth thrived prior to the arrival of us, rather than found their purpose in our coming here. There's a lie that everything was made for us. It's not only grandiose, but vile. Humans are not separate from, superior to, the reason for, or the rulers of God's earth. And God's Cain conquistador worldview needs to be condemned, certainly by Christians, and hopefully by others too. Number 5, God's voice, message, and actions are embedded in 2 scriptures. The Reformation principle of sola scriptura, or the Bible alone, is not sufficient either for understanding God's story of life or for understanding God's story of Jesus in the context of God's story of life. Both are equal and both are needed. Number 6, humans are created in the image of God and in the image of all other creatures. We forget either at our peril and shame, and this is what has happened. Some of us have forgotten one, others the other, and some both. Number 7, humans are emotionally, intellectually, physically, spiritually advanced in some ways, and very underdeveloped in many others. We are not the crown of creation, but rather we are members of a family that lives in God's household. Number 8, the biblical fall stories refer to a series of events that are recent in human history rather than original, and are even going today. Number 9, life under Cain's rule as opposed to God's brings destruction as opposed to blessing. A helpful metaphor for thinking about Cain's worldview is the pyramid of Pharaoh's Egypt. Pharaoh's Egypt was a Cain culture, if there ever was one. At the top are the politically connected and those with either earned or inherited privilege. These folks reap the most benefits of this pyramid. Then comes individuals and industries and corporations that control land and resources. Next are the workers, farmers, teachers, tradesmen and women. And then slaves, or those who work for slave wages. The surrounding poor nations are Cain's prey, from which Cain extracts resources, minerals that sustain his lifestyle, including cheap labor. And finally, at the bottom, the community of life is treated with the most disregard in this system. Cain's worldview and rule will always bring destruction rather than blessing. And the keepers of the system are, first of all, the military, who through force and the threat of force and the appearance of the threat of force leverage the world in Cain's favor, so Cain can keep up his high level of consumption. The other keeper is religion, including Christianity, which sanctifies this system and says it is of God. One further arm of Cain is what we might call false patriotism, or religion-fueled nationalism. God and country is Cain's destructive mantra here. But for Christians, God's story of life and God's story of Jesus calls us to very different values and priorities. First, of course, there's God. But next comes the well-being of all creation, the soil, the waters, the atmosphere, plant and animal life, God's household. Then, it seems, would come general humanity, the common good of all, so that all have enough and none too much, as Daniel Erlander says, because to not have enough is deadly, and to have too much is deadly. Next comes, for Christians anyways, the church, the body of Christ, which transcends all boundaries and borders and walls. how great it is to worship with other Christians in other countries and in other languages. And finally, when the first four priorities have been thoroughly and responsibly taken care of, one should value and be loyal to their own country or nation. God, creation, humanity, church, country. This probably doesn't fit on a bumper sticker as well as the superficial but deadly God and country nonsense. But it sure is more in line with God's deeper values and priorities. Number 10. Earth is humanity's home, not a disposable way station on the road to an afterlife or heaven. I believe in heaven, to be sure, after I die, but this is my home now. And if I can't live responsibly within the community of life here on earth, how will I live responsibly within the community of life in heaven? And to think that, well, if we wreck this biosphere, we'll just go somewhere else is a perverse lie. Number 11. Jesus Christ came with a mission to heal Cain and his legacy, not to affirm Cain's worldview or to offer Cain a salvific escape from the consequences of his malfeasance. And finally, Jesus did not come to die a cross death, but rather to live a cross life. And yes, living a cross life and able life got him killed. But he rose on Easter, and because of this is alive today, announcing the same forgiveness that he announced when he walked in Galilee, and calling and instructing every human today to follow him into relationship recovery with neighbor, creation, inner soul, and with God. God's goal for us is not that we be Christians, but that we be followers, spiritually and physically, of Christ, of Abel of Nazareth. So, how different have these 5 Good Soil Talks been for how you've understood and practiced Christianity? Perhaps these ideas are new for you, or maybe you have been thinking along these lines long before I even began to. But for me, what it means to be a Christian at the core has significantly shifted in recent years. There's been a shaking of the foundations, to use Paul Tillich's phrase, and the implications are bursting out of my soul. My overall thesis, of course, is that the narrative must change from Cain's to Abel's. I'm excited about this new turn and find myself ever more caught up in God's story of life and God's story of Jesus. If you want to explore these ideas more, here are a couple of books that I've written that delve into this further. And you can see my contact information. But I thank you for being a part of these Good Soil Talks. Grace and peace, God's grace and peace be with you.